There is a moment in every empire's life when its greatest strengths quietly become its deepest vulnerabilities. Not through war, not through ideology, but through dependence specifically. Dependence on a system it no longer controls. In the early 21st century, the United States built an economy on speed, convenience, and efficiency. It wanted goods delivered cheaper, faster, and at unimaginable scale. And without realizing it, that desire handed China control over the most important economic architecture in the modern world, the global supply chain. It didn't happen through treaties or armies. There were no dramatic announcements, no headline-making confrontations. It happened gradually, decade by decade, port by port, industry by industry. American companies outsourced to cut costs. Chinese factories expanded to meet demand. Ships grew larger. Ports became automated, and production centralized in places Americans would never see. By the time anyone questioned the imbalance, the structure was already set. Today, every sector, technology, medicine, transport, defense depends on supply routes, stretching thousands of miles across oceans and straits China directly influences. A disruption in one region can freeze industries continents away. A slowdown at a single port can ripple across the entire global economy. What began as efficiency became dependency. Dependency became vulnerability. And that vulnerability became a geopolitical weapon. This is the story of how China reshaped the world not by firing a shot, but by mastering the arteries of global trade, and why the consequences are only now being understood. The modern supply chain didn't begin in a boardroom or a government ministry. It began with a simple assumption that globalization would make the world more connected, more efficient, and ultimately more stable. In the closing years of the 20th century, the United States believed it was shaping this new order. It had the world's strongest navy, the world's largest consumer market, and the world's most advanced technology sector. It assumed the rules of global trade would always reflect American interests. But history rarely works according to assumptions. The structure that would one day give China unprecedented geopolitical leverage was already forming quietly, long before anyone recognized its implications. The economic transformation of China started in 1978, when Deng Xiaoping opened the nation's locked economic doors and pushed for manufacturing-led growth. At the time, the United States saw an opportunity: cheap labor, an emerging market, and a potential political ally. American corporations saw something else: cost savings on a scale that felt almost impossible to resist. If a factory in Ohio produced a part for $7, a factory in Guangdong could produce it for $1. Those numbers changed everything. What followed wasn't a policy shift. It was a migration. Thousands of American companies moved production overseas. They didn't do it out of ideology or long-term planning. They did it because quarterly reports rewarded cost cuts and higher margins. Politicians encouraged it, believing economic integration would democratize China. Economists praised it, convinced the world was entering a post-industrial era of efficiency. Very few paused to consider the strategic consequences of a nation's production base being relocated to a foreign competitor's territory. In the 1992 and early 2000s, China built factories at a speed the world had never seen. Entire cities became production zones. Ports expanded. Highways appeared where farmland used to be. The Chinese government didn't just support industrialization, it engineered it. Every component of the emerging system had a purpose. Low labor costs attracted foreign firms. State-backed loans built massive logistical centers. Meanwhile, most Western nations assumed they were entering a future defined not by manufacturing, but by innovation. They believed the intangible software, finance, intellectual property was the new engine of global power. Manufacturing, in their eyes, was a relic of an older industrial age. And in that single belief, the stage was set for one of the greatest geopolitical transforms of the modern era. Because the intangible may shape the future, but the tangible sustains it. Every device, every medicine, every vehicle, every defense system begins as a physical component produced somewhere by someone. Throughout the 1990 seconds, the restructuring of global production accelerated. Retailers built business models around low-cost Chinese manufacturing. Electronics brands moved entire product lines abroad. Pharmaceutical companies outsourced basic chemicals and precursors. Auto manufacturers shifted key component production to Chinese suppliers. The logic was simple. China made things cheaper and faster. But the economic logic obscured the strategic reality. A nation that controls production controls leverage. As American companies celebrated rising profits, China expanded its capabilities, not just in scale, but in complexity. In the early years, Chinese factories produced simple goods, clothing, plastics, basic electronics. China moved up the value chain. Advanced machinery, telecommunications equipment, semiconductors, rare earth processing, and industrial chemicals became new pillars of its economy. Each shift created another layer of global dependence. Throughout this period, the Chinese government played a guiding role. State-owned enterprises dominated key sectors, ensuring that strategic industries didn't fragment or drift abroad. When foreign firms brought advanced technology into China, joint venture rules ensured that knowledge eventually transferred to domestic partners. This wasn't accidental. It was intentional. A national project to centralize global manufacturing within China's borders. The United States, meanwhile, continued to outsource. The logic of corporate profit intersected with the optimism of global interdependence. Every factory that closed in the Midwest was defended as an inevitable part of progress. The supply chain became invisible, something that existed behind screens, spreadsheets, and shipping containers crossing the Pacific. Few people asked what would happen if that system ever came under stress. But stress was coming. By the late 2000s, China wasn't just producing goods. It was building the infrastructure that would channel global trade. Massive deep-water ports connected to expansive highway systems. Inland rail lines linked coastal factories to Central Asian markets. Special economic zones evolved into manufacturing ecosystems. And supporting all of this was a state-backed logistical network, the skeleton of what would later become a tool of strategic influence. The global financial crisis of 2008 accelerated China's ascent. While Western economies contracted, China launched the largest stimulus program in its history. Much of it targeted toward infrastructure and industrial expansion. Western companies, desperate to cut costs even further, doubled down on outsourcing. China became the workshop of the world, not because of a single event, but because of 1,000 decisions made across decades. Each one rational in isolation, yet collectively transformative. By the early 2010 seconds, something important had changed, though most policymakers didn't fully grasp it. China was no longer just a participant in global trade. It was becoming the central node. For many industries, shifting production elsewhere was no longer realistic. Too many suppliers were concentrated in a single region. Too much infrastructure was built around Chinese ports. Too many critical materials flowed through China-controlled channels. Dependency had quietly replaced efficiency. What had begun as an economic partnership had evolved into structural reliance, and the foundation of that reliance was simple. Production had moved offshore, while consumption remained at home. The origins of China's supply chain dominance were not dramatic. They were incremental, gradual, almost mundane. And in that environment, China built a system with implications that would only become clear decades later. The story of how China turned the supply chain into a geopolitical weapon does not begin with confrontation. It begins with partnership, one that seemed beneficial to both sides, until it no longer was. The rise of China's supply chain dominance didn't occur through a single breakthrough. It unfolded through a series of quiet structural shifts, each small enough to escape alarm, but powerful enough to reshape the global economy once accumulated. By the late 2000s and early 2010 seconds, China had moved from being a low-cost manufacturing hub to becoming the operational center of the world's industrial system. What emerged wasn't just a network of factories, it was an interconnected web of logistics, resources, financing, and technology that positioned China at the heart of global production. It started with scale. No other nation in history had built industrial capacity so rapidly or so comprehensively. Entire sectors, textiles, machinery, electronics, automotive components, pharmaceuticals, clustered into vast manufacturing ecosystems. These weren't isolated factories. They were dense, self-sustaining networks, Suppliers, subcontractors, raw material processors, mold makers, tool makers, packaging companies, transportation fleets, and export terminals, all functioning as a single machine. A product that took 3 months to coordinate in Europe could be assembled in a matter of days in Shenzhen or Ningbo, because every part of the chain existed within a short drive. Scale alone wasn't enough, though. China understood that controlling production required controlling movement, so it built the most extensive infrastructure network the world had seen since the Industrial Revolution. Ports expanded into megastructures capable of unloading vessels faster than any competitor. High-speed rail linked coastal cities with inland manufacturing hubs, moving goods with military precision. Highways, logistics parks, and automated distribution centers blanketed the landscape. As Western nations debated budgets and environmental reviews, China poured concrete, laid steel, and opened new trade corridors year after year. That momentum accelerated with the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. Strategically, it was something deeper, an attempt to bind dozens of nations into China-centered trade routes. New ports in South Asia, railways in Central Asia, bridges in Africa, and pipelines across Eurasia all extended China's logistical reach. The benefits were subtle but profound. Any company that relied on these routes, whether knowingly or indirectly, was relying on infrastructure shaped, financed, and with every bridge, port, and rail line built abroad, the gravitational pull of China's economy grew stronger. Meanwhile, China advanced in sectors that few outside the industry paid attention to. Rare earth processing became a near monopoly, basic pharmaceutical ingredients centralized in Chinese factories. Solar panel production shifted overwhelmingly to China. Even the packaging and shipping materials needed to move goods around the world flowed through Chinese suppliers. Dependency deepened in places consumers never noticed, but industries could not function without. American and European firms recognized China's capabilities, but they misunderstood the nature of the system developing around them. They saw cheap labor and fast turnaround times. China saw control. They saw profit margins. China saw leverage. They viewed factories as interchangeable. China built them to be irreplaceable. By the mid-2010 seconds, global corporations had integrated China so deeply into their supply chains that relocation was no longer a practical option. Even when rising labor costs pushed some labor-intensive industries to Vietnam, Cambodia, or Mexico, the critical upstream components still flowed from China. A company could assemble a product elsewhere, but its parts, the motors, sensors, semiconductors, chemical precursors, machine tools, were often made in Chinese industrial zones. This created what economists called network dependency. A disruption in one node could disable entire industries across continents. Two events made this reality unmistakable. The first was the 2011 Tonso-Hoku earthquake in Japan. When just a handful of Japanese component manufacturers were knocked offline, global production lines in electronics and automotive sectors froze. The world realized how fragile and interconnected supply chains had become, but the concentration inside China was even greater. The second was the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic. When Chinese factories shut down temporarily, shelves around the world emptied. Pharmaceutical shortages emerged. Electronics lead times soared. Auto plants across multiple countries halted production for lack of a few critical microchips. For the first time, governments and corporations confronted a truth that had been building for decades. The world could not function without Chinese production. But while the pandemic revealed the depth of China's integration, it also highlighted the strategic value of that dominance. China understood better than anyone that supply chains could serve as instruments of statecraft. It had spent years experimenting with targeted restrictions limiting rare earth exports to Japan during a diplomatic dispute, slowing customs processing for companies that criticized government policies, or offering favorable terms to nations that aligned with its geopolitical goals. None of these actions were dramatic enough to provoke a crisis. Each served as a reminder. Dependency has consequences. The deeper China's integration grew, the more reliant the world became on its logistical rhythm. A temporary shutdown in Shanghai could delay product launches in Silicon Valley. A policy shift in Beijing could alter supply flows in Europe. China had achieved something rare in geopolitics. influence without confrontation, leverage without open conflict. By the end of the 2010 seconds, China wasn't merely the world's factory. It was the operational core of global production. Western nations had assumed that economic integration would moderate China or eventually reshape it. Instead, integration strengthened China and reshaped everyone else. The rise of China's supply chain dominance had reached its peak not through force, but through architecture. What began as an economic partnership had evolved into a form of structural power, subtle, far-reaching, and extraordinarily difficult to unwind. By the late 2010 seconds, the supply chain was no longer just an economic engine. What had begun as efficiency evolved into a strategic contest, where influence was measured not in territory or ideology, but in control of production, logistics, and materials that powered modern life. The system worked smoothly as long as interests aligned. But when they diverged, tensions surfaced, revealing a deeper truth. The world's economic stability rested on a structure vulnerable to political pressure, national security concerns, and systemic fragility. The first cracks appeared quietly. Companies operating in China began facing pressure to comply with rules that blurred the line between commercial cooperation and political obligation. Intellectual property had long been a point of friction, but the stakes grew higher as Chinese firms moved into advanced sectors, telecommunications, aerospace, AI hardware, and electric vehicles. Western companies found themselves navigating a landscape where technology transfer was expected, regulatory enforcement could shift unexpectedly, and access to key markets depended on staying in Beijing's good graces. Then came the 2018 trade conflict between the United States and China. For years, American policymakers had assumed economic integration would limit strategic rivalry. Instead, competition intensified. Tariffs were imposed, countermeasures followed, and businesses on both sides were caught in the crossfire. It wasn't the tariffs themselves that signaled a turning point. It was the reaction. Western firms realized how deeply they were tied to a system they didn't control. Chinese suppliers worried about losing core markets. The supply chain, once invisible, became a source of political vulnerability. As tensions escalated, governments began reassessing the risks. Intelligence agencies flagged potential vulnerabilities in telecommunications networks built with Chinese hardware. Economists traced critical supply chains and found chokepoints that ran almost entirely through China pharmaceutical ingredients, rare earth elements, advanced magnets, drone components. What had once been celebrated as global integration now looked alarmingly like concentration. China, for its part, saw these reactions as confirmation that its rise had shifted global power dynamics. It responded with policies designed to reinforce self-sufficiency while deepening other nations' dependence. Dual circulation, a strategy introduced in 2020, aimed to strengthen domestic production for its internal market while maintaining China's central role in global trade. The message was clear. China would not step back from its position. It intended to expand it. At the same time, the Chinese government showed it was willing to use economic leverage in political disputes. Restrictions on Australian imports after Canberra called for a COVID origins investigation. Slowdowns in customs clearance for companies whose governments criticised Beijing's actions. Export controls on rare earth elements during diplomatic standoffs. Each incident, viewed individually, appeared manageable. Meanwhile, multinational corporations faced an impossible dilemma. They relied on China's speed, cost advantages, and vast industrial ecosystem, but they also recognized the political risks, sudden regulations, data laws, and potential sanctions. Efforts to diversify production moved slowly. Companies discovered that building a factory elsewhere was easier than replicating the surrounding ecosystem of suppliers, logistics, and skilled workers that made China unparalleled. Every attempt to shift production revealed how deeply the world had embedded itself in China's industrial architecture. The COVID-19 pandemic amplified these tensions. Nations scrambled for medical supplies, and the fragility of global logistics became undeniable. Some countries accused others of hoarding. Others relied on China's ability to restart production faster than anyone else. As governments fought supply shortages, China used its manufacturing capacity to strengthen diplomatic ties. The world needed Chinese production, and Beijing understood that need. By the early 2022s, the conflict was no longer just economic. Western governments debated decoupling while acknowledging that full separation was unrealistic. China doubled down on technologies it saw as foundational to future power batteries, chip-making equipment, green energy components, confident that controlling tomorrow's industries would offer even greater leverage than dominating today's ones. The corruption wasn't of individuals, it was of assumptions. The long-held belief that global supply chains were neutral, apolitical structures collapsed under the weight of geopolitical reality. The conflict wasn't declared, but it was unmistakable. The system that once promised stability now seemed capable of creating the opposite. China and the West were no longer partners bound by shared economic interest. They had become rivals, entangled in a system neither could unwind without risking collapse. By the mid-2022s, the global supply chain had reached a breaking point, not because a single catastrophe struck, but because the system had become too interconnected, too concentrated, and too vulnerable to withstand the pressures placed upon it. The world had built its economic framework on the assumption that efficiency equaled stability. But under strain, that assumption failed. What followed was not a sudden collapse, but a grinding, uneven transformation marked by shortages, political clashes, and a global reckoning with dependence. The first phase of this transformation emerged through recurring disruptions. A logistics slowdown in southern China could delay goods across multiple continents. A lockdown in a single port city could freeze thousands of shipping containers. When Taiwan experienced a major drought, semiconductor production fell, causing worldwide shortages in electronics and automobiles. Each event revealed how little redundancy existed. Industries operated on thin margins, assuming shipments would arrive exactly when needed. When they didn't, factories stalled. Consumers saw empty shelves. Prices surged. Governments realized they were no longer dealing with isolated problems. They were confronting a structural weakness. Nations dependent on foreign production found themselves negotiating for basic goods, pharmaceutical ingredients, chips, batteries, as if managing national emergencies. The idea that supply chains were neutral market systems disappeared. They had become geopolitical lifelines. The United States, Europe, Japan, India, and other nations launched initiatives to rebuild domestic manufacturing. Semiconductors, energy storage, pharmaceuticals, and rare earth processing became top priorities. Massive subsidies were introduced, regulations were rewritten, but even with political will and financial resources, rebuilding what had taken China decades to perfect proved far slower and far more complicated than policymakers expected. Factories could be constructed, but the supplier ecosystems that made China efficient were nearly impossible to replicate quickly. A single electric vehicle battery requires thousands of components sourced from dozens of suppliers. A delay in one small chemical could stall an entire production line. Nations discovered that independence was not simply a matter of building more facilities. It required reimagining the entire architecture of production. China, meanwhile, faced its own challenges. Rising labor costs, demographic decline, and geopolitical pushback threatened the model that had fueled its ascent. Yet these pressures did not weaken its position as much as some expected. Instead, they encouraged China to double down on high-value industries. The nation invested heavily in advanced manufacturing, lithium processing, chip packaging, green energy components, ensuring that even if low-cost manufacturing moved elsewhere, the world would remain tied to Chinese supply networks. But the transformation wasn't limited to economics. It reshaped geopolitics. Nations strategically aligned themselves based on access to materials and trade corridors. Alliances shifted around logistics as much as ideology. New trade blocs emerged. Old ones fractured. Influence was measured in shipping capacity, port control, and resource access. The battleground of power had moved from borders to supply routes. The strain reached a tipping point when multiple disruptions overlapped natural disasters, political conflicts, and energy shortages. Companies redesigned products to reduce dependence on single suppliers. Governments built stockpiles of critical materials. Corporations mapped their supply chains for the first time with clarity, discovering vulnerabilities they had overlooked for decades. The transformation was messy, uneven, and costly, but beneath the turbulence, something new was forming. a more distributed model of global production. Southeast Asia, India, Eastern Europe, and parts of Africa began emerging as alternative hubs. Companies diversified not out of preference, but necessity. China did not lose its position, but it no longer stood alone at the center. Its dominance began to shift from absolute to relative. The world was no longer moving toward decoupling. It was moving toward rebalancing. The age of a single nation functioning as the world's primary manufacturing core was slowly giving way to a fragmented, multipolar system defined by competition, caution, and strategic diversification. The collapse was not of China, nor of globalization itself, but of the idea that a highly centralized supply chain could sustain a stable world. What emerged from the disruption was a different structure, less efficient, more costly, but ultimately more aware of the risks the previous era had ignored. The world had learned, painfully, that efficiency without resilience is not strength. It is fragility disguised as progress. The legacy of China's ascent in the global supply chain is not a single lesson, but a constellation of realizations, economic, political, and moral, that nations are only now beginning to confront. For more than 3 decades, the world treated global production as an engineering problem. Optimize the routes, minimize the costs, accelerate the movement. But the deeper truth revealed by the last 20 years is that supply chains are not neutral structures. They carry with them the values, ambitions, and power of the nations that build and control them. China understood this earlier than most. It built an industrial system not merely to enrich itself, but to shape the global order around its influence. The world, eager for efficiency, allowed this concentration to grow until it became indispensable. That dependence provided China with a quiet form of leverage, one that reshaped modern geopolitics more profoundly than conventional military power ever could. Ships and factories became instruments of strategy. Logistics became a form of soft coercion. But the transformation that followed, triggered by pandemics, shortages, geopolitical tensions, forced nations to reconsider what they value in their economic systems. The pursuit of cost alone had created fragility. The race toward efficiency had hollowed out resilience. And dependence on a single nation had introduced risks that no price advantage could justify. As governments and corporations rethink their supply networks, a new global reality is emerging. Production is slowly dispersing across regions. No single nation is likely to recreate the scale China achieved, but many are striving to rebuild portions of what they lost. The process is slow, uneven, and expensive. Yet it marks a profound shift in how the world understands economic security. For China, the legacy is equally complex. Its rise demonstrated the power of industrial strength in a world that had underestimated manufacturing. But it also revealed the limits of dominance. The more central China became, the more the world feared its leverage, and the more determined other nations became to reduce their vulnerability. China remains essential, but the era of unquestioned dependence is fading. For the United States and other Western nations, the lesson is sobering. They learned that outsourcing entire sectors may bring short-term gains but long-term vulnerability. They discovered that innovation alone cannot compensate for losing control of production. And they recognized, belatedly, that economic architecture is a form of geopolitical power as decisive as armies or alliances. The supply chain that once symbolized globalization now symbolizes something deeper: the tension between efficiency and sovereignty, between profit and resilience. The world is left navigating these contradictions, uncertain of what the next era will bring. But one truth stands above all. Every empire, every nation, every generation must decide what it is willing to control and what it is willing to trust others to control. The modern world trusted too much, too easily, without understanding the cost. The legacy of China's rise is not the dominance itself. It is the reminder that economic structures shape political outcomes, and that the foundations of power are often built in places the world ignores: factories, ports, shipping lanes, and the silent movement of goods that keeps nations alive. In the end, this is the story of how the world discovered that the supply chain was never just a network. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.